If she plays piano, I quit. Laughed the principal, not knowing the black girl was already legend. The auditorium lights burned bright, washing over rows of polished wooden chairs filled with restless students, impatient teachers, and a scattering of skeptical parents. At the center of it all sat the upright piano, a black monument of expectation and judgment. The stage was cold, but the eyes watching it burned hotter than fire. At the edge of the stage stood a man in a gray suit, his face lined with arrogance, his thin lips curled into a smile that was more mockery than warmth. This was the principal, a man who carried himself like he was the gatekeeper of dreams. His sharp jawline, his piercing blue eyes, and the slight shake of his head told the crowd everything. He did not believe in the young girl who was about to step forward. The girl herself walked slowly toward the piano. Her small frame carried a weight far heavier than her years. Her skin glowed under the stage lights, smooth and deep, a crown of tightly braided hair resting above a face that looked both nervous and unshakably determined. Her eyes, dark, wide, and watchful, revealed the storm inside her. Behind her, whispers floated like daggers in the air. Some faces sneered, some chuckled, and some simply waited for her to fail. She had lived with this gaze her whole life. The gaze that said you're less, you are small, you are unworthy. And yet, tonight, she walked toward the piano as if she had carried the keys inside her chest all along. The principal crossed his arms, leaned slightly forward, and smirked. The words he had spoken before her entrance still rang in everyone's mind. If she plays piano, I quit. The audience had laughed, some nervously, some cruelly. But the man meant it. His laughter had been sharp, echoing, confident. And in that moment, his face became the symbol of every barrier ever built in front of her. The piano bench creaked as she lowered herself onto it. She placed her hands above the keys, but did not press down. Instead, she let silence sit heavy across the hall. Her shoulders straightened, her chin lifted. She knew this silence was power. She had learned to hold it until the world leaned in. Her mother sat in the third row, her eyes wet, her hands pressed together as if in prayer. The years of sacrifice had carved themselves into her mother's face, lines etched from endless work shifts, sleepless nights, and unbroken faith. Her mother had sold things that should never have been sold, taken jobs no one else wanted. Also, her daughter could have a chance to touch music in its purest form. And now here she was, sitting in front of a piano that might become her altar or her grave. The audience shifted impatiently. The principal tapped his polished shoe against the stage floor. His face, still smug, seemed to say, "See? She's hesitating. She doesn't belong here." But the girl wasn't hesitating. She was listening. She was listening to the hum of electricity in the lights, the faint cough of a child in the back row, the heartbeat in her own ears. And when her fingers finally fell upon the keys, the sound that followed did not belong to a beginner, nor even to a prodigy. It belonged to something timeless. Her touch was delicate, but it carried thunder. Notes cascaded like water over stone, sharp and smooth, unstoppable. Each chord vibrated through the wooden floorboards and into the very bones of the listeners. Her face transformed, not shy, not uncertain, but radiant, alive, fierce. She was no longer the girl who had walked timidly to the bench. She was something greater, something undeniable. The hall fell silent except for her music. Teachers who had doubted her leaned forward, their faces shifting from boredom to awe. Students who had whispered insults now sat still, their mouths slightly open, eyes fixed on the stage. Parents who had pitted her mother's sacrifices now felt shame prick at their skin. And the principal's smirk melted into something else. His lips parted, his forehead creased, and for the first time, his eyes betrayed fear. She was not just playing. She was telling a story through every strike of the keys. A story of a little girl practicing on broken instruments, of fingers bleeding against ivory that was chipped and unforgiving, of nights when hunger gnawed, but the music gave her strength. Each crescendo carried her past, each pause whispered of her pain, and every flourish thundered with her resilience. It was as though the piano had been waiting for her all its life. Though it seemed to vibrate beneath her hands, the strings ringing with something almost divine. Her body swayed with the rhythm, her face glowing with the kind of fire that no ridicule could extinguish. And still, the principal sat in his chair, frozen. His mind raced to find words, excuses, explanations. But there were none. He was watching the very thing he had mocked take form before his eyes, greatness. The performance stretched on, each measure more powerful than the last, until the final note lingered like a prayer over the room. When her fingers lifted from the keys, silence once again filled the hall. But this silence was different. It was reverent. It was stunned. It was the silence of people realizing they had witnessed something unforgettable. The girl lowered her hands to her lap, her chest rising and falling with quiet dignity. She didn't smile. She didn't seek approval. She simply sat there, as if she knew what they now knew. She had already been a legend long before this night. The audience erupted in applause, wild, thunderous, uncontrollable. Her mother stood, tears streaming down her face, clapping harder than anyone. Students who had once mocked her now rose to their feet, shouting, cheering, their faces filled with awe. Teachers looked at one another, shaking their heads in disbelief. And the principal, his hand stayed still, his face flushed red. The laughter he had thrown into the air earlier now felt like a noose tightening around his own throat. The promise he had made, the arrogance of it, was echoing in every mind. If she plays piano, I quit. The crowd's applause seemed to pin him to his seat. Everyone was watching, not just her anymore, but him. What would he do? Would he keep his word? Or would he try to bury the shame that had just been unearthed before all? The girl stood slowly, bowed with grace, and walked off the stage, leaving the echo of her music in the air like smoke that refused to fade. And in that moment, as the crowd's eyes shifted back to the principal, the story was no longer just about a girl and a piano. It was about what happens when truth shatters pride, when sacrifice forces its way into the light, when legend reveals itself in the least expected places. The chapter closed with the weight of a single question pressing down on the principal's shoulders, one he could not escape. Would he keep his promise? The hall had not yet settled. Applause had thundered, then softened, then returned again in scattered waves, but the air still trembled as though the girl's final note lingered in the very walls. Faces glistened with awe, hands remained frozen mid-clap, and for a moment, the entire audience seemed unwilling to move, unwilling to break the sacred stillness she had created. But one man did not share the awe. The principal sat rigid in his chair, his jaw clenched so tightly that the muscles in his face quivered. The words he had spoken so boldly before, his laughter, his promise, now returned like ghosts circling him. If she plays piano, I quit. Everyone remembered. Every student. Every teacher. Every parent. The crowd's eyes turned toward him now, just as sharp, just as piercing as the ones he had once turned upon her. His smirk had vanished, replaced by a flush that crept up his neck. His blue eyes darted nervously across the room, but there was no refuge. The trap he had built with his own arrogance had snapped shut. The girl walked down the steps of the stage, her small frame glowing under the lights. Her face, no longer tense, carried quiet dignity. She passed rows of students whose faces reflected a new truth. No longer mockery, no longer pity, but respect, even awe. Her mother's trembling hands reached for her, drawing her into an embrace that was fierce and unbreakable. Their faces pressed together, both glistening with tears, a portrait of sacrifice meeting reward. The principal's chair groaned as he rose to his feet. The crowd fell silent again, not out of respect, but anticipation. This was his moment now. Would he honor his word? Would he step down, humbled before the very student he had mocked? Or would he twist, wriggle, and claw his way out of the corner he had painted himself into? His lips parted as though to speak, but no sound came. His throat bobbed, his hands fidgeted, his forehead glistened under the lights. The audience leaned forward, their faces taut with expectation. Even the teachers who had once aligned themselves with him now looked at him with subtle distance, their folded arms and stiff postures betraying their discomfort. He wanted to speak, to control the narrative again, but the truth was too heavy. The image of the girl at the piano had branded itself into everyone's minds. Her music had made his arrogance look pitiful, his cruelty look childish. And in that moment, he felt smaller than he had ever felt before. The girl, still in her mother's arms, turned slightly. Her eyes met his. There was no triumph in her gaze, no bitterness, no demand for revenge. It was only calm. It was this calm that crushed him the most. She did not need his validation. She had already won. The silence deepened, stretching into something unbearable. Finally, a murmur began to ripple through the audience. Whispers became questions, questions became pressure, and pressure became demand. Faces turned harder, sharper. Parents looked at him with narrowed eyes. Students pointed, remembering his mocking laughter. Teachers shook their heads. The promise he had made was no longer just a statement. It was now the very test of his integrity. His shoulders sagged. His face fell into lines of defeat. And with a slow, unsteady breath, he stepped forward. Every eye followed him. Every ear strained to hear the decision he could no longer avoid. He had mocked a child, dismissed a legend, and underestimated a sacrifice he could never comprehend. Now, he would face the cost. And yet, even in this moment, his pride clawed at him. He searched for an escape, a loophole, a way to soften the fall. His mind raced with excuses. Perhaps she had been secretly trained. Perhaps it had all been arranged. Perhaps his words had been taken out of context. But the truth was too bright to deny, and the eyes around him too unforgiving. At last, he bowed his head. His face, once confident and smug, now looked hollow. Wrinkles etched themselves deeper across his brow, and his lips trembled as though admitting defeat was breaking him apart. The crowd gasped softly. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others smiled, almost vindicated, but the girl and her mother did not move. They simply watched, their faces calm, their hearts steady. This was not about his downfall. It was about their rising. He turned, his steps heavy, and walked away from the stage. His figure, once commanding, now seemed diminished, swallowed by the very hall he had ruled over for so long. Each step echoed with finality. He did not look back. He could not. The audience erupted once more, but this time the applause was not for him. It was for her. The girl stood tall beside her mother, her face radiant, her spirit untouchable. This was her moment now, and no one could take it away. And yet, even as joy filled the room, something deeper stirred in the air. This was not the end of her story. It was only the beginning. For greatness is not measured in the defeat of those who doubt you. It is measured in the paths you carve, the sacrifices you honor, and the lives you transform. And as the girl looked toward the future, her face glowing under the lights, it was clear her journey was far from over. Because legends are not made in a single performance. They're made in what comes after. The chapter closed with a single truth pressing forward. The world had just witnessed her power, but now it would test how far she could carry it. And the greatest challenge was still waiting. The days after that night did not fade quietly. The performance had planted itself in every corner of the school, every home that had witnessed it, and every heart that had heard it. Her name, once whispered in mockery, now echoed in reverence. Students repeated the moment as though retelling a myth. Parents spoke of it at dinner tables, calling it history. Teachers, once doubtful, now spoke with pride, claiming they had always known she was destined for greatness. And yet, she herself remained unchanged. Her face was calm, her walk was steady, and her eyes remained fixed not on the applause of the moment, but on the horizon ahead. For she knew applause was temporary. Music was eternal. But greatness carries weight. With recognition came expectations. People now looked at her differently, no longer the unnoticed girl in the back row, but a figure who had to prove herself again and again. Where once they had dismissed her, now they demanded of her. And for a young girl, still learning the shape of her own voice, the demand pressed heavily against her shoulders. Her mother, however, never wavered. The lines of sacrifice etched into her face deepened with both exhaustion and pride. She rose earlier, worked harder, gave more, because she knew the world had finally opened a crack, and through that crack her daughter's light could now shine. Every coin she saved, every extra hour she endured, was poured back into that dream. The face of her mother became the silent anchor of it all. Tired eyes, strong hands, and a love too fierce to measure. The principal, meanwhile, was gone. His office emptied, his name removed, his legacy reduced to a single night of arrogance. His face, once sharp and commanding, now lived only in memory, a reminder of what happens when pride mocks truth. For the school, his absence left a strange silence. But for the girl, it was no victory to gloat over. She carried no joy in his fall, only the quiet knowledge that the world had finally been forced to see her. Weeks turned into months, and then the unexpected came. A letter arrived, thick with official seals, its envelope heavy as though carrying destiny itself. Inside lay an invitation, one she could scarcely believe. A prestigious conservatory, known worldwide, had heard of the story, had seen the footage of her performance pass from phone to phone, screen to screen. They wanted her. They wanted the girl who had turned doubt into thunder. The moment she held that letter, her face lit with something her mother had not seen since childhood, unguarded joy. Her eyes widened, her lips trembled into a smile. And for the first time, she let herself believe fully in what she had always known deep down, that she was meant for this. Her mother's tears fell freely, streaking down cheeks carved by struggle. The two embraced, their faces pressed close, both radiant with the knowledge that every sacrifice had not been in vain. The day of departure came. The community gathered, lining the streets, faces glowing with pride. Those who had once sneered now clapped her on the back, offering words of blessing. Students waved, their young faces bright with admiration, seeing in her a possibility they had never before imagined for themselves. Teachers stood straighter, knowing they had witnessed the rise of someone who would one day stand among the greats. She stepped into the car that would carry her toward her new beginning, her face serene, her posture tall. Her mother stood by the roadside, hands clasped together, tears shining like jewels in the morning sun. Their eyes met one last time before the journey began. In that gaze was everything: the pain, the struggle, the love, the victory. The car pulled away, but her legend did not leave with her. It stayed behind, woven into the hall where she had first played, whispered in the classroom she once sat in, carried in the hearts of those who had seen what determination looks like when clothed in flesh and blood. And though the world would come to know her as a celebrated musician, those stages far grander than that school hall would one day bear witness to her gift. The moral of her story remained unshaken. That greatness is not born of privilege, but of sacrifice. That true power does not shout, but sings. That the mockery of the proud will always collapse in the face of undeniable truth. And that legends are not created in moments. They are revealed by them. Her face, once overlooked, now shown as a beacon for every child told they were not enough, for every parent who sacrificed in silence, for every soul waiting for the chance to prove what the world refused to see. The chapter closed not with applause, but with a vision, a young black girl at a piano, her fingers moving like fire and water, her eyes alight with destiny, her music echoing into eternity. And for those who had once laughed, their faces would forever remember the night they saw a legend born.